Welcome to Question Mark, the podcast, exploring the greatest story ever told with open minds and open hearts.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. And this is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. And this is the greatest show.
Hello and welcome to Question Mark, a fortnightly podcast about the greatest story ever told, Mark's Gospel. Whether this is the first episode you've listened to or you're a regular listener, we're very pleased that you could join us today. My name's David Payne and I'll be your host for this, the 32nd episode. We're nearly halfway on the journey through Mark's Gospel. This tale is surely as relevant to life in the 21st century as it was to first century believers. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce our special guest, Jenny Baker. Jenny, I understand you are the national leader of Celebrate. I hope I got this right. You're the lay leader in the Catholic Church and have headed up many national events as well as events in your parish. I know people personally who've been involved in your Celebrate conferences over the years and seem to have been very much impacted by them. And they're lovely people as well, actually. So I'm looking forward to chatting with you and maybe hearing a bit more about what you do. Tell us, how do you know Steph and what's Celebrate?
How I know Steph, I can't quite remember, Steph, how we met, but I know that I had a look at your I Am Mark recordings and was blown away about them and by them. And then we got chatting and we met over Zoom, I think, at the time.
Yeah.
So that was before COVID, I think. So a few years ago now. Yeah. Celebrate is a Catholic ministry that is specifically looks at equipping, connecting, and inspiring people to live a Christian life in the power of the Holy Spirit. And we do that through family faith formation. These are our key areas: faith formation, through the strengthening of local community, and also forming the next generation. And that's through events, training our leaders, producing resources. So lots of different areas that we're involved in. And we've been going about 30 years now. So yeah, that's who we are.
Brilliant. And people can find out more you have a website, I guess, do you?
Yeah, it's www.celebratetrust.org. And that would tell you more about what Celebrate is and what we produce.
Sounds great. Thank you very much. Lovely to have you.
Thank you.
And Stephen Smart, I think people might know, has recently been performing his one-man performance of Mark's Gospel around the country again, and will be appearing at the Edinburgh Fringe in early August. He had this great idea of inviting friends from many different backgrounds to meet up to chat about the life of Jesus as presented in Mark's Gospel, which is how we come to be here today. So I just wonder, Steph, what it's like for you to do these presentations, and do you have a favorite place to do it?
Wow, it is lovely. It does feel like I've come home when I do the presentation because it's just so enjoyable interacting with an audience, but using these words, the words of Scripture, and kind of hoping that in doing it, it will bring the Bible alive. And it's a wonderful experience. And so, yeah, I absolutely love what I do. Favorite place, that is so hard. Probably the last place I performed in, so I'm being diplomatic now, but
how did I know you were going to say that?
But
okay, let's get on with today's show. So first of all, we're going to hear today's passage, which is going to be read for us by a friend of the show, Lucy Warner. Lucy.
Mark chapter 8, verses 22 to 26, New International Version. Jesus heals a blind man at Bethsaida. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into the village."
Thank you, Lucy. Well, firstly, Jenny, we'll let the guest go first. I wonder what your initial thoughts are when you look at this passage. Is there a main point you'd like to start with?
Oh, you know, I've spent quite a lot of time, obviously, reading it and meditating on it and thinking about it and praying through it. I think it is the sweetest story. It's just the most beautiful, tender account of Jesus's love and touch, really. And that's the first thing. I mean, then you know, you go through. Gosh, there's so many layers to this. There's so much in it. You're amazed at just however many lines it is, and I can't remember how many lines. That there is just so much depth to the account of this blind man. I suppose the first thing I sort of really thought about was this touch, really, the fact that there was a touch of Jesus to this man who was blind. And you know, I think we can read this without even thinking about it. But if somebody can't see and are never touched, because you know, blind people, lepers, you know, all of the people that were had all sorts of areas, difficulties and disabilities like that, they wouldn't have been touched, is my understanding. And so this physical touch was just probably something that we can't imagine. And the only way I related it to it more recently is my mum during COVID. You know, she lives on her own, and I couldn't touch her.
Yes.
And we used to go and visit her from a distance and wave at her, and you know, put a shopping in the back door. I would actually quite often unpack her shopping and wipe it all down, but couldn't get close to her. And I just remember the first time I was able to hug her and touch her, and she was just, you know, so desperate for that.
Yeah.
And so I suppose that was the first thing, just that sense of touch must have been so incredible for that man.
Oh, thank you. I like that. Lovely. Steph, what's your...
Well, I think I just want to say a little bit about what Jenny just said. I think that's right. I just agree so much about Jesus having the time, the patience, the compassion to touch this man, to lead him by the hand. That sense of gentleness as well comes through. The fact that he listens to the people begging him, that his heart is melted, we can assume by that. And I think, you know, so many of these stories do underline his compassion, you know, and that's how we experience him, isn't it? That almighty, brilliant, powerful being that he is, but also how compassionate, loving and tender he is too. And yeah, that was the first thing that struck me too. But I've got to say, the one thing that comes up for me in this passage is this whole issue of blindness and seeing, which I know we're going to be talking about a bit later, but that is a theme that happens again and again, especially in this part of the gospel. So yeah, let's see what we can come up with.
Okay, well, we have some listeners, as you know, and some members of the Facebook community who've sent some questions in, and so I've got 3 or 4 questions. The first one is, touching on what you just said, Steph, is there a parallel message from the author or from Jesus or both, that the man is not healed immediately, but in 2 stages, just as the disciples perhaps are gradually realizing who Jesus is, but not everything is revealed to them at once? It seems to come in stages. So is there a parallel story going on? I think there probably obviously is, but Jenny, do you want to say something about it?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, really? But I think you're right. There probably is. The fact he said to the disciples, you know, you've got eyes and you can't see, and then this happened.
Yes.
And so it was perhaps a sort of explanation, a physical explanation to them to, you know, see, I can make all people see. But the progression of it, I think, is probably to do with revelation, and to do with the fact that for some of us, we're a bit slow, maybe like the disciples, a bit slow to get the point. And I was thinking about that passage in 1 Corinthians 13 that says, now we see as a reflection in a mirror. One day we'll see face to face, paraphrasing it, but that there is this incredible progression. And yeah, I think sometimes, well, definitely I'm slow to see. Sometimes there's this that I live in dim light. I don't always live in the full light of Jesus. So I think revelation is, thank God I had the revelation of Jesus, but I think there's so much more that I'm yet to receive, which is exciting, because you can never get bored with God, because there's always more, isn't there? There's always more and more that he's going to reveal to you.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Steph, I just noticed those words. There's more to see all the time, every time you read it, isn't there? Do you see anything, Jesus? Almost as though, following on from saying, are you blind, but you can't see, and deaf, you can't hear? What are you going to say about the
Well, I agree. Again, I totally get what Jenny's saying. And this idea that we're like the disciples, it's fascinating. From a performance point of view, I think I might have mentioned this before, that often I direct my gaze at imaginary disciples if I'm, say, playing the part of Jesus, but also very occasionally, more often these days, I'll look in the audience's faces as if they too are the disciples. In fact, they are the ones being addressed. And I think that is what happens in Mark's gospel, that, Jenny gave the positive view, which is, and I think it's right, we've always got more to learn and there's always more to see. But the negative view is, and in this case of the disciples as well, is, we can be dull. We can be quite dull. And just because we know the end of the story, this story, Mark's gospel, doesn't mean to say that we're any less in need of revelation as the disciples. I think there's a bit of a challenge to us as well as a comfort in some ways.
Yeah.
I think the key question, and again, we don't have to talk about it immediately, is what is it that the disciples aren't seeing? I think we can talk about general revelation, but is there something, I wonder, specific here? And there could be all sorts of answers. I don't know whether you have any thoughts about that, Jenny, as to what you think the disciples are not getting.
Well, I think they don't see him necessarily at this stage in the fullness of the revelation of who he is. And we see that as a progression, don't we? Because after this passage, there is the declaration by Peter of saying, this is who you are. This is my understanding, which is so beautiful. This laying everything on the line. I've realized, the lights come on. And why that is, I can only talk from my own experience, that sometimes I think, sometimes we can choose not to see everything. Sometimes, there's fear or distraction, and we don't necessarily want to see everything. Perhaps we're fearful that we're not worthy of the fullness of God's revelation. I remember, and sometimes, maybe we choose to live in the dark. I remember when my first date with my husband, I contacted my mum unexpectedly and said, hey, I'm going to bring, she knew I was really falling for this guy, and I'm going to bring him back to the house. And she was like, but you can't, we've only just arrived home from holiday and the house is in a real mess. And, I haven't got time, it was the evening. And so I said, sorry, but I've got to take him, I've got to bring him back. So I brought him back, and she had taken the lights out of the bulbs out of some of the lights in the house, in the sitting room. So there was only one lamp with a bulb in it. And so we went in there in this dim light to try and see. I think he probably thought we were crazy. And I was like, what is going on? But she took the lights out because she didn't want him to see all the dust and the dog hair and all of the things that, you know, she hadn't got around to tidying up. And sometimes when I think about that, I think that, you know, sometimes we choose to take light bulbs out because our lives are a bit grubby and grimy, and you know, we know that there's things there that need to be sorted out. But God's so good to us because he just allows us that revelation in our own time. Yes. He puts on the lights, you know, when they're ready. Yes. And that is just such a beautiful thing.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I love that. I wonder too about how we can be set in our ways as well. I mean, I think that's possibly true of the disciples here. We have a kind of worldview or paradigm about how things really are. And that may be because we've been brought up that way, or whether even we've been taught that way in church in the past, and we kind of stick to it because it's secure. But I think sometimes God shakes that up, doesn't he? And I'm sure that's what's going on. I wonder in this case, I mean, there's so many different theories about what they haven't seen. And I agree with you that the Peter episode that comes next seems to be key, because he does tell Jesus that he's the Christ, doesn't he? And he gets that revelation. But then he goes on to argue with Jesus about who the Christ actually is or what he came to do. And I don't think he saw the idea of a suffering servant at all. He saw this victorious, kind of all-conquering Christ who comes in the cause of the Jewish people to defeat their enemies. And that's what he argued with Jesus. And clearly Jesus doesn't accept that and says, "Get behind me, Satan," and so on. So there is a seeing, but not necessarily a full seeing. It's perhaps only afterwards at the resurrection that they begin to see who Jesus really is. And I think that's a general view, and I think that's a really, really interesting one. And right, I'm sure it's right. But I'm wondering too whether there's something about knowing who Jesus is, but not necessarily seeing who he represents or the kind of lifestyle he represents, which is one of sacrifice and giving and denying oneself. And Jesus has to explain this, doesn't he? In the next few verses, really. There's something about seeing, and I must admit, I was really challenged by this passage, and it was actually an incident that happened to me last night, where, as I thought about this man who is prayed for, and initially what he sees are trees walking around. So I'm assuming those people he sees are people in the distance. They're not people right close up. He can see Jesus. He looks up at Jesus. He can see him clearly, but what he can't see are the people in the distance. They're kind of fuzzy, blurry objects. They look like trees walking around. I think that's probably what that means. And I think, hold on, this is so true of me too. I kid myself sometimes, perhaps, that my faith is strong in Jesus. But is that also complemented by my also seeing others as well in terms of their need? I don't know. I must admit, a little bit I am probably very self-centered. And an example of that was last night. I was watching Sherwood. So this will date the episode, but I'm really liking that series. And I started watching it in my TV upstairs. I mean, it's a warm night, so I open the windows, and the episode was getting really exciting, and I had the volume up really loud, and it came to the end of the episode, and it was getting really, really amazing and exciting. And my wife walks in and she says, "Don't you realize you've got the windows open and all the neighbors?" And of course, I was absolutely oblivious to this. My concern was to enjoy the episode at full volume and make sure that I get enough air in the room, because, you know, it's a warm night. And it just proves the point that so often we can not see others. I think the disciples do get that same problem. I think if in the rest of this passage, you know, all the way through chapter 10 as well, 9 and 10, the children are brought to Jesus and they say, "Go, no, we don't want the children." A man casts out demons. Oh, he's not one of us. They have an argument about who's the greatest. They just focused on self, their own kind of promotion, not thinking about others at all. So I like this story. It kind of fits in well with that.
No, I really agree. I don't know what you're saying about how we think we can see, but we do have blind spots, don't we? And I remember my daughter going to the opticians, and they gave her a particular test which revealed to them and to her that she has a limited periphery vision for one reason or another. Yeah. And yet she'd lived happened to her when she was in her 20s. And she'd lived all that time with no knowledge that her vision was limited. And I think that often I'm the same. I think that I know, many things maybe about God, but there is so much to discover and so much to learn, really. I think that's just a wonderful thing.
Yes.
And I love the contrast, the fact that God is all seeing. God sees everything. There's a beautiful, I think it's a Hebrew name for God, El Roi. I think it's ELROI, which means the God who sees. I remember reading that once and just thinking, that God sees us and he knows us. And so he is all seeing, and he wants us to have more and more revelation.
That's right. I agree. And in this story as well, doesn't it? It is actually quite hope-filling that the man does see finally. And Mark reiterates that. He says, then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. I kind of think the 3 points there, he says the same thing 3 times, suggest that this is actually meant to be a parallel to something, as we said earlier. But the fact is also that the man does see everything. And it's interesting, the Greek for seeing everything clearly is actually seeing far away, seeing everything far away. So it's not just seeing nearsighted, it's also having far sight, if that's the right phrase. So you're seeing the whole thing. I think that does give us hope that God is in the business of helping us to see fully.
Sorry, just something that made me think actually, about seeing is that I don't know if you remember, The Guardian, I think it was The Guardian, did a series of advertisements years and years ago where they showed something being seen from different perspectives. And I don't know if you remember those, but there was a skinhead that was running down the road, and he pushed this man to the ground, and you saw it from that angle and you thought, this guy's really being violent. And then they switched it and you saw that he pushed this man to the ground because something was falling from above, so he was saving them. I can't quite remember if that was exactly right, but I think it was either The Guardian or one of the newspapers, or probably another different newspaper. But it's just seeing that perspective. And actually the words of Jesus when he says to the man, what can you see, or can you see anything? I really found that quite something for me to take into prayer. That what can you see, not through your own perspective, but through God's perspective, God's eyes. And that is such a challenge for me, to look at people and things and circumstances and situations on a daily basis through his eyes and not my own.
A great provocation, isn't it? Is that God saying, come on, what do you want to see? What is there to see? And in both ways.
I suddenly feel inspired to say this. I think this is a message for everyone, not just for us believers, isn't it? That we can, all of us, spend our lives thinking we know everything or we see everything when we clearly don't. And it does take God's touch to reveal. So if we're set in our ways and think, oh, God doesn't exist, I've been through, done that, been there, done that, or I can't believe in God. Well, actually, there are other ways of seeing in the way that Jenny's described.
Yes. Very good. We could probably spend all day on this, all the whole episode on this. Let's move on to another question, which is, why did Jesus lead the man out of the village? With the listeners mentioned, it seemed like a sign of his care that he leads the man by the hand, as you mentioned, rather than expecting someone to do it. And then why was he told not to go back there, though curiously he was allowed to go home? Any thoughts about that, Jenny? I think you said it's a good question. I don't know whether I've got
it's a great question. It's hard, isn't it? Because we are presuming. And it made me sort of investigate a bit more about, the people that brought the blind man to Jesus. We've no idea if they were his friends or whether they were just people that wanted to see the sign, that like previously he'd been talking about the Pharisees wanting to see a sign, and this generation won't see a sign. And so we don't know if they were just like, come on, we want to see this. So possibly, I've no idea, but possibly it's just that sort of taking him to one side. We don't know if he was, how he was, whether he had faith or whether he was just being used by these people. I'm sure he did grow in faith through this and have the light shining on him through the first thing him seeing is Jesus's face when he brought him to fullness of sight. But I just think Jesus knows these things, doesn't he? And he knows when we need that encounter, that personal, intimate time alone with him.
Yeah.
And so I just feel that maybe in this particular case, he felt it would be the best for this man to have that one-to-one time. Yeah. Where the disciples were, they might have been the people from the distance with the trees.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Steph, what about?
I agree. I think that it is likely, perhaps, or certainly possible. Jesus is showing a degree of empathy with the man and wanting to support him in this. But I also wonder whether there's something going on regarding Jesus's own concern about the situation generally for him, because right from chapter 3, the Pharisees and the Herodians, the teachers of the law from Jerusalem, they're pretty much out to get him, and the word is that they determined to kill him. So he's a hunted man, and I do think that fairly close to this passage, he's come to the revelation, probably as he will see, as he tells Peter and the rest of the disciples in a moment, that he's going to die. But I don't think he's into people taking him and arresting him too soon. There is a sense, I think, in which telling the man not to go into the village kind of delays things for him. He can make a bit of a getaway, and therefore stay out of trouble, at least for the time being. There's this sense from what I can get from reading between the lines, admittedly, Jesus kind of knows what he's about. He knows he's going to be going to Jerusalem. So there's a way in which he's trying to make sure in a way that happens. I think that's probably what's going on. Obviously, when he does go back to the village, eventually the news will spread, but hopefully Jesus is long gone.
Good. And we've talked about, how compassionate Jesus is and kind, but we've and that's all very lovely and beautiful. We've got to talk about spitting, really, haven't we, in this day and age?
Yes.
I mean, I was told spitting's rude and nasty and you shouldn't do it. It's not nice. Maybe things were different in those days. Or maybe, as our listener suggests, the spit coming out of Jesus's mouth perhaps emphasizes that what comes out of Jesus's mouth is powerful. I'm not entirely convinced by that, but I don't know. What do you think? We've got to talk about spit, haven't we, Jenny?
Yeah, it really does make you like, oh, doesn't it?
You just take that breath out.
Actually, I was talking to my great friend about spitting, after I knew that I was going to be talking about the passage. And she told me that she used to live in Tuvalu years ago, which is in the South Pacific. And she said that the gardeners in the sort of area that she lived in, quite often they would take a gulp of water in their mouth, and then they would spray the water over the flowers. And I thought, oh, I like that sense of spitting.Maybe Jesus, sprayed some water, but that probably isn't the case. I also thought, what a great thought that she had, that it was the power coming out of Jesus. But I think for me, there is a lot of, if you look at all the miracles, there's a lot of touch and taste and spit and spittle and paste and all of these sort of human things, aren't they? All of them. And what happens is that Jesus takes those human things and he makes them divine. And I mean, I come, from a Catholic church, so I come from a sacramental church. So this for me is very relevant, really, to the way in which we worship, and I've grown up, because coming from a sacramental church, we have lots of our sacraments are, we use things like water and oil, and we have candles and incense and all of those things. And what we learn as Catholics is, or those who come from a sacramental church, that they are what we call outward signs of inward grace. And so that's like using the human things that internally, invisibly, have this deep, incredible grace of God that point to the grace of God and what can the way God works internally. So it's sort of outward examples, outward pointers to help us to understand the grace of God, because we're human beings and we need to be able to touch and taste and use our senses, really. So I just felt that maybe that is, for me, an understanding, helps me to understand that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I love that. I think, for us, I think David and I are not from a Catholic background, but it's something I am beginning to appreciate about the Roman Catholic Church. I think it probably underlines the fact that God is not just a God of spirit. I think we can easily super spiritualize God. Mm-hmm. He's a God of matter as well. He made it and he uses it to bless us. And so that answer really does emphasize that. I have to confess at this point that when it comes to this performance, the performance of this little bit, I do really sanitize Jesus's spitting. So what I do is I spit into my hands like this and then put my hands apparently on the man's eyes. And clearly that's not, well, I have to say, I don't think that's what's going on. I think it actually says he spits on the man's eyes. I mean, that's directly on the man's eyes. So that makes it a lot less kind of healthy. I know there are lots of theories about this. I wonder, again, whether it's a sign of Jesus's compassion, perhaps, that Jesus communicates because the man is blind, but he can feel, he can sense touch. So spitting is a kind of way of communicating. I'm dealing with this. Perhaps also, I know the theologians, I think Marcus Borg is one, who say that this was quite common. This is the way people healed in those days. So he was just doing what people expect. Maybe. I have to say that there is a guy called Ched Myers who's written a great book on Mark's Gospel. And I think Ched Myers probably would be less into miracles in terms of thinking that actually really did happen. But there is something he says about this one, which is fascinating. And I wonder whether for the early listeners to this story, they would have actually thought about what he says, which is at the same time, more or less, about AD 70, maybe a little bit before then, there was a famous incident that happened to the Emperor Vespasian. I think he was in Egypt, and there was a blind man that was brought to him. And Vespasian was saying, "Oh, what do you want me to do?" And the people who came to him said, "Could you heal him, please?" Because they thought Vespasian was a god. And Vespasian said, "Well, I'm not a god, I'm not a god." But he actually did spit on the man's eyes. And the man did really see. This is the story as it goes. And I think there were a couple of versions of the story. And then Vespasian said to himself, "Well, I must be a god then. I must be a god." Now, this was just before he himself destroyed the temple in AD 70, his legions, and basically defeated the place where God is supposed to have resided. So for the people in those days who were listening to the story, I wonder what they were thinking. Hold on, they may have been thinking, Jesus is doing the same thing, but Jesus is a very different kind of God. Mm. This is a God of compassion, not a God of conquest, not a God of divide and rule and annihilation, as Vespasian clearly is, not a God of conquering territory or getting one up on other people. This is a God of humility and a God of self-sacrifice who dies on a cross. There are very different kinds of gods. And I do wonder whether Mark has got a political message. You know, right from the very beginning of the story, he says, the gospel, this is the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Well, the emperors used to announce, didn't they? This is the good news of the divine Augustus, the Son of God. So there's a challenge going on, perhaps, within this story. I don't wonder. It's a great idea. I'm not sure how valid it is.
I read it. I mean, I love that. That's so interesting because I've never heard that before. I read something about the fact that possibly that that this man was not a man born blind. Yeah. He could well, it doesn't say anything about the fact that he was born blind. So it could be that he'd had an accident, or, you know, that there was a reason. And so I read something about the fact that the saliva could have been like a soothing thing if there was a rawness or, you know, a painful scarring in any way. And I thought, oh, that was interesting. That's another way to show Jesus's compassion. Yeah. So yeah, there's all these different possibilities which are fascinating, really.
It's really about it as well, isn't it? And just to have time to open up these ideas. I don't know where time's gone today, but we're coming towards an end. Jenny, I do like to ask our guests what it is that's so special about this great story in their lives personally. You've devoted much time and energy to proclaiming the gospel in your life. And I just wonder, could you share with us a little bit about why? What is it about Jesus that so attracts you and energizes you?
Well, I mean, I couldn't begin to, you know, spend all the time to talking about what he's done for me and my life. I think one of the things that just what's special about this passage, what has become special, having spent a few days now thinking about this and meditating on it, is that, and we've mentioned it a few times about the tenderness of this passage. And one of the things that, as we talked about, I come from a Catholic background, and we, as you all know, have Pope Francis. We have wonderful Pope Francis, and one of the things that he has really called us to in the last, well, since he brought out his first apostolic exhortation, which is like a letter to the churches, is he's calling us to a revolution of tenderness. And he's calling all people, not just, you know, as Catholics, but all of us, Christians and non-Christians alike, to a revolution of tenderness. And he says that using our eyes to see the other, and our ears to hear the other, and our hands to comfort and care for the other. And that for me is just the message of Jesus. You know, he is a revolutionary in the best possible way, a revolutionary of love. And so this shows really the way, and the way in which I want to follow, which is to become a revolutionary for Jesus, really.
Amazing. That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Jenny and Stefan as well, thank you so much for taking time to share your thoughts with us today. It's been a real pleasure, and hopefully we'll have raised more questions as well as giving some insights for our listeners into what God's like. Thank you so much for joining me today. Please join us again or listen to previous episodes, which can be found on Spotify and Apple Music platforms, and on YouTube if you'd like to see our faces. We'd love you to like and subscribe and tell your friends about it in the old-fashioned way if you've enjoyed today's conversation. We're so grateful to members of the I Am Mark community group on Facebook as well. You know who you are, and we really appreciate you. If you're not already part of the group, Lucy's about to tell you how to find us on Facebook and join in the conversation. That's all we have time for now. So it's goodbye from Jenny Baker.
Goodbye.
Goodbye from Stefan Smart.
Bye-bye.
And until next time, goodbye from me. Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode of Question Mark and don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to click on the subscribe button. This also means other people can find the podcast and join the conversation too. We'd also love if you could leave a review so we know what was good and what we can improve for future episodes. If you want to find out more about I Am Mark, Stefan Smart's solo word-for-word dramatisation of Mark's Gospel, go to www.sleek.bio/IamMark, where you can sign up for free for his newsletter and a whole host of other goodies. Join us and our special guests next time, where we'll continue to explore the greatest story ever told together. If you want to get involved with the podcast or have any questions or comments in the meantime, please do get in touch using the I Am Mark social media channels. We'd love to hear from you.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.